Chapter 1. The Book That Did Not Belong. The first thing Edward Lansing noticed was the ladder. Not because there was anything unusual about a ladder in a bookshop, quite the opposite, but because this one leaned against a shelf that held nothing of any particular value, and yet had been polished along its rungs, as though it were used daily, carefully, even affectionate. He stood just inside the doorway, still holding his gloves, while the bell above the shop door finished its hesitant ringing. The shop smelled of paper and old polish. Yes, but beneath that, something sharper lingered. Not unpleasant, simply deliberate, like the faint trace of cloves left behind after mulled wine had been cleared away. "Come in, properly, dear," said a voice from somewhere among the shelves. "The door lets in a most unhelpful draught, and books dislike draughts even more than people do." Edward closed the door at once, though he had not been aware of leaving it open. He stepped further inside, careful of the uneven floor, and found the speaker seated near a small table arranged with teacups, and a plate of something iced and slightly collapsing at the edges. Miss Marple looked up at him with mild interest, as though she had been expecting him for years without quite knowing his name. "You are new to this shop," she said, not unkindly. "One can always tell. Regular visitors walk more slowly. They already know which boards complain." Edward smiled in reflex, though he was not certain why. "I was told," he began, "that Bellamy's might have a first edition of—" "Yes," she said gently. "Everyone is told that. It is quite the most persistent rumour. Whether it is true is a separate matter, and one Mr. Bellamy guards, rather like a terrier, with a bone." She gestured to the chair opposite her. "You may sit, if you are not in a hurry to be disappointed." Edward sat. He became aware, as he did so, of the shop's silence, not empty, but layered. The sort of silence that held whispers in it, pages turning long ago, conversations half finished. "You will forgive me," Miss Marple went on, pouring tea with steady hands, "but I have always found bookshops to be rather revealing places. People show themselves most clearly when they believe they are alone among stories." Edward accepted the tea. It tasted faintly of orange peel. "Are you a collector?" she asked. "Not particularly. I was hoping to start." "Ah," she said. "Beginnings are always so hopeful. I remember in St. Mary Mead a Mr. Julian Frobisher began collecting clocks. Very earnest about it he was, talking of mechanisms and craftsmanship, all quite admirable. It turned out, of course, that what he truly collected was admiration. The clocks were merely a means to arrange it." Edward laughed politely. Miss Marple smiled, as though that had confirmed something for her. From deeper in the shop came the sound of a book being closed, firmly, almost sharply. A man emerged. Arthur de Bellamy was not tall, nor particularly imposing, yet there was something about the way he held himself that suggested everything around him existed under a quiet, careful arrangement. "Good morning," he said, his tone precise. "If you are looking for Dickens, I regret to say it has already been spoken about." Edward had not mentioned Dickens. Many people come in asking for it," Bellamy continued. "It simplifies matters if I answer before they do." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "It is always interesting," she murmured, "when a person answers a question that has not yet been asked." Bellamy's gaze flicked to her. "Efficiency is rarely interesting," he said. "It is simply necessary." He turned back to Edward. "If there is something else you require, I will assist you. Otherwise, browsing is permitted, though I ask that you handle the books with respect." Edward rose, murmuring thanks, and moved toward the shelves. He did not at first notice the book. It was only when he reached for another, something bound in dark green leather, that his hand brushed against it. A slim volume, out of place. Not because of its age or its condition, but because of its position set slightly forward, as though it had been returned hastily, or placed deliberately to be seen. Edward drew it out. The cover was plain, no title. He opened it. Inside, the pages were blank. Not aged blank, not yellowed or foxed, but clean, recent, untouched. "Curious thing," said Miss Marple from her chair. "Books that pretend to be older than they are. One sees it sometimes in people too, though it is less charming." Edward turned. "I beg your pardon?" She smiled. "Oh, nothing of consequence, dear. Only that I have never trusted objects that have no proper history. They always turn out to have too much of one." Bellamy crossed the room more quickly than before. "That book," he said, reaching out, "is not for sale." Edward handed it over at once. "Of course. I didn't realize. It is unfinished," Bellamy said, slipping it back onto the shelf, but not quite where it had been, slightly further in, less visible. Miss Marple watched this with interest. "Unfinished things," she said softly. have a way of insisting on being completed, even when one would very much prefer they did not. Bellamy did not respond. Instead, he returned to his place deeper in the shop. Though Edward noticed that he did not pick up another book, he simply stood, listening. Edward wandered further, though his attention had shifted. The ladder again, that polished ladder, resting against shelves no one seemed to need, and above it a narrow landing, barely visible, leading perhaps to the attic. He turned back. Miss Marple was watching the ladder too. "In St. Mary Mead," she said, as though continuing a conversation they had not begun, "there was a woman named Eliza Perkin who insisted her attic was haunted. Most inconvenient, as she kept her winter preserves there. No one would go up to fetch them, you see. It turned out not to be a ghost at all, only her nephew, coming in at night to remove jars one by one. He found it easier to frighten her than to explain himself." Edward smiled faintly. "And was he discovered?" "Oh yes," said Miss Marple. "Such things always are. People imagine that fear conceals the truth. It does the opposite, of course. It draws attention precisely where it is least wanted." Edward glanced again toward the ladder, and just for a moment he thought he saw something move. Not clearly, not enough to be certain, but enough. When he looked again, there was nothing there. Miss Marple set down her teacup. "Ah," she said quietly, "that is interesting." Edward turned to her. "What is?" She folded her hands. "My dear," she said, "I believe this may prove to be a most instructive visit." And somewhere above them, the faintest sound. Not footsteps, not quite, but something that had weight. Chapter 2. A shop full of explanations. Edward Lansing had never cared for places in which every object appeared to possess a reason beyond its obvious use. In ordinary rooms, a chair was meant for sitting in, a table for putting things upon, and a lamp for light. In Bellamy's bookshop, each item seemed to carry some private intention. The brass candlesticks on the mantel had been turned not outward, toward the room, but slightly inward, as though arranged for someone standing in a particular place. A little convex mirror, no larger than a saucer, hung high in one corner where it could not possibly flatter anyone. Even the bell pull beside the rear passage had been tied with fresh black ribbon, though Christmas greenery lay about elsewhere, with a cheerfulness that failed to reach it. Arthur Bellamy, who must certainly have felt Edward's eyes moving from object to object, came back from the rear of the shop with the look of a man who preferred his visitors to notice only what they had been invited to notice. "You are welcome to look in the front room," he said, in that neat voice of his, "and the travel shelves beyond the arch. I would rather ask you not to go upstairs. The floorboards there are uncertain, and one must be practical about such matters." Miss Marple, who had accepted a second half-cup of tea, as if the decision had been made by Providence rather than by herself, glanced up with mild surprise. "How sensible," she said, "though I have known people to call a thing unsafe when what they really meant was private. Not that one blames them. Privacy is very nearly extinct." Bellamy the smallest of smiles, the kind that did not alter his face so much as tighten it. "In my experience," he said, "privacy is best preserved by locks and clear instructions. Sentiment is unreliable." "That is true," said Miss Marple, "and yet one is often betrayed by what one chooses to protect. In St. Mary Mead there was a Mrs. Brierly, who kept the drawing-room cabinet locked for 22 years. We all supposed there was silver in it, or letters, or perhaps some little disgrace from before the war. When at last it was opened, there were only wax oranges. She had once been praised for them by a curate she hoped to marry, and after he went elsewhere she could not bear anyone to know how small the reason had been." Bellamy made no reply to that. He turned instead to Edward. "If there is an author you particularly seek, I may save you time." Edward, who had rather lost interest in books as books, and found himself increasingly occupied by the manner in which people spoke about them, said the first respectable thing that came to mind. "I have always liked memoirs, travel, letters, journals, the sort of books that tell you more than the writer intended." Bellamy gave him a sharper glance, though whether from approval or unease it was difficult to say. "Second room on the left," he said. "Lower shelves. Please use the step-stool and not the ladder." He moved away at once, but not before Edward saw him look upward, just once, toward the ceiling above the front room. It was not the glance of a man checking plaster. It was the glance of a man listening for a person who was meant to remain quiet. Edward crossed through the archway. The second room was narrower and colder than the first. Books ran from skirting boards to beams in shelves, built at different times by different hands, with that faint mismatch which makes a room more intimate rather than less. The wallpaper, visible only in narrow strips, had once shown trailing ivy in green and faded gold. A coal fire had burned in the grate recently, but not enough to take the particular chill from the window glass. It smelled here of wool coats dried too close to heat, and of bindings left near damp over too many winters. There were indeed memoirs. Clergyman in Italy, a woman who had crossed India in 1903 with opinions about everything and understanding of nothing, a naval officer whose recollections of storms were far more vivid than his recollections of people. Edward ran a finger along the spines, listening without meaning to the sounds in the other room. Bellamy's voice once, low, a reply from a woman he had not yet met, then the clearer note of Miss Marple. "My dear, you need not be uneasy. When a room has secrets in it, one feels them whether one has been told them or not. It is rather like lavender water. You may stop the bottle very firmly, but some fragrance escapes into the linen cupboard all the same." The unknown woman said something too softly for Edward to catch. Then came Bellamy again, still measured, though with effort underneath it. "I do not care for that kind of conversation in the hearing of customers." Edward pretended, out of decency, to be deeply occupied by a volume on Venetian church bells. Presently he heard footsteps, not from the front room but from the back corridor. A woman entered carrying a tray of cups. She was perhaps in her early 40s, with chestnut hair drawn back smoothly, and a face that would have been called kind by anyone not looking closely. Edward, who had grown up among women experts at social surfaces, thought at once that kindness was what she knew how to look like. She stopped when she saw him. "Oh," she said, and then, with a gentle correction of herself, "I had not realized Mr. Bellamy had another visitor. I do beg your pardon. We have all been rather turned upside down these last few days." Her voice was soft and cultivated, with the faint stage-managed warmth of a person long practised in smoothing awkwardness. Edward introduced himself. "Clara Hastings," she said. "I handle 1 or 2 literary estates with Arthur, or for him, depending on which of us is telling the story. At Christmas, one becomes useful in all directions. Letters, invoices, worried descendants, impossible catalogues." She smiled, but her fingers tightened on the tray. "Not much. Enough." Edward, because he felt she expected easy conversation, said, "Miss Marple mentioned a ghost." Mrs. Hastings did not start. That was what Edward noticed first. She did not start, though many innocent people would have done. Instead, she lowered her eyes to the cups and adjusted 1 teaspoon so that it lay exactly parallel to the rim. "Miss Marple is a charming woman," she said, "and old houses do encourage nonsense. Arthur dislikes it being repeated. The neighbourhood lives on stories, and Christmas makes everyone half theatrical." She moved to set the tray on a side table, and as she did so, Edward saw a smear of candle wax on her right cuff, white against dark blue wool. "You have candles upstairs?" he asked before thinking. Again, not a start, only that same minute pause. "In boxes mostly," she said. "Nothing romantic, I am afraid. The electrics behave badly in the attic, and one must see where one is putting one's feet. Though I should not advise going up there. Everything smells of dust and old glue, and one comes down looking as if one has been rolled under a sofa." Miss Marple had appeared in the doorway without Edward hearing her. "Attics are so revealing," she said. "People say they put things there to save them, but most often they put them there not to see them. One can tell a great deal about a family by what has been carried upward rather than thrown away." Mrs. Hastings turned with a pleasant expression that had become, in the space of a heartbeat, extremely guarded. "You make us sound quite wicked, Miss Marple." "No, no," said Miss Marple with her sweetly troubled air. "Only humans and human beings are very odd creatures. They keep wedding dresses in trunks after unhappy marriages, and children's shoes after those children are grey-haired, and letters tied in ribbon long after the writer has become tiresome. There is no wickedness in that. Only hope that the past may yet explain itself." Mrs. Hastings gave a little laugh. It was perfectly judged. It was also, Edward thought, a fraction too late. Bellamy entered behind Miss Marple. "Clara," he said, "would you see whether the back gate is properly latched? The carol singers leaned against it yesterday, and nearly had the whole thing over." "Of course," she answered, "though if they were the same children as last year, they would climb a church tower for 6pence and think themselves underpaid." She took her gloves from the chair by the passage, nodded to Edward, and went out through the rear hall. Her departure was graceful. It was also swift. Bellamy stood quite still until the back door shut. Then he crossed to the window and watched the courtyard, though from where Edward stood one could see almost nothing except a stone basin full of black water and the pale backs of overturned teacups left on the garden wall. Miss Marple resumed her seat, as if all this were part of an afternoon's ordinary social interest. "Have you known Mrs. Hastings for a long time?" she asked. Bellamy did not turn round. "Long enough. She is devoted," said Miss Marple. "That is sometimes a blessing and sometimes a very heavy burden." Bellamy turned then, and Edward saw that the man's careful face had altered. Not much, and only for a moment, but the control had thinned. "You speak," he said, "as though you know something of my affairs. My dear Mr. Bellamy," said Miss Marple, "I know nothing of your affairs. I only know people." The two subjects overlap much more often than one would wish. There was movement above them, distinct this time, not the vague settling of an old building, not a mouse, not branches scratching, a measured sound, a step, then another. Edward looked up. Bellamy did not. That, more than the sound itself, gave the thing its weight. A man startled by harmless noise glances up. A man who has been expecting something dreadful stands rigid and listens to hear whether it will continue. Miss Marple put down her teaspoon. "Perhaps," she said in a conversational tone, "someone has forgotten your instructions about the stairs." "No one is upstairs," Bellamy said. The words were too quick. Then the sound came again, directly above the front room, followed by what might have been the faint drag of fabric against wood. Edward felt, absurdly, the skin rise on his arms. Bellamy moved at last. He crossed to the narrow passage beside the staircase, stopped with his hand on the banister, and called upward without raising his voice. "If anyone is there, kindly answer me. I have no patience for performances." Nothing. Then, from the ceiling above them, a soft tap, like knuckles against timber. Miss Marple looked not at the staircase, but at the little convex mirror in the corner. "How very odd," she said. Edward followed her gaze. In the curve of the glass, warped and tiny, he could see the landing above the shop, reflected at an angle impossible from the floor. For the briefest instant, something pale seemed to pass through it. Not a face exactly, more like the trailing edge of a sleeve. Bellamy saw it too. He went white, not dramatically, but with the terrible economy of a man whose blood has somewhere else to be. "I must ask you both," he said, his voice now scraped thin, "to leave the matter alone." Miss Marple folded her hands. "That," she said gently, "is almost always the one thing that cannot be done." And from the back courtyard there came Clara Hastings's voice, calling in with practised calm, that did not somehow sound calm at all. "Arthur, would you come here for a moment? There is something at the gate you ought to see." Bellamy closed his eyes for 1 second only. When he opened them, he looked like a man who had just understood that whatever he feared had arrived before he was ready, and Edward, though he did not know why, had the strongest conviction that the blank book on the shelf was not blank at all. Chapter 3. What the ladder remembered, Miss Marple did not rise immediately. That, Edward thought later, was the moment that mattered most, not the sound above, not Clara Hastings's voice from the courtyard, not even the peculiar flicker in the convex mirror, but the fact that Miss Marple remained seated for just a few seconds longer than politeness required. There was no hesitation. It was a selection. She lifted her teacup, though she did not drink from it, and turned it slightly, so that the faint light from the front window caught along its rim. "People are always in such a hurry to respond to what calls them," she said almost to herself. "It is rarely the calling that is important. It is the choosing." Arthur Bellamy did not answer. He had already moved toward the rear passage, though not with the briskness of a man going to address a simple matter. There was something in the way he walked, a tightening, a calculation, that suggested he was deciding not merely what to do, but how to appear while doing it. Edward followed him, without quite meaning to. The passage to the courtyard was narrower than he had first supposed. It bent slightly to the left, where a row of framed prints hung, architectural studies of churches, each drawn with that delicate precision that suggested admiration rather than faith. One frame had been hung a fraction too low. Edward noticed it because the nail beneath had been driven in twice, leaving a small splintered mark in the wood. Clara Hastings stood just outside the back door, one gloved hand resting on the latch. Frost had settled along the edges of the stone path, tracing the irregularities in white. The basin Edward had glimpsed from the window held a thin film of ice, cracked at one corner where something had disturbed it. "There," she said, gesturing toward the gate. It was ajar, not wide, only enough to suggest it had been pushed and not properly closed again. The iron latch hung slightly askew, as though it had been lifted and allowed to fall without care. "I am certain I fastened it," Clara continued. "I always do because of the cat next door. It has a way of insinuating itself into places where it is not wanted, and Arthur dislikes animals in the shop." "I dislike unpredictability," Bellamy said, stepping out into the courtyard. "Animals are merely one form of it." He examined the latch, lifted it, and set it again. It clicked into place with a clean, decisive sound. "There is nothing here," he said. Clara did not move. "There was a moment ago," she replied with a softness that might have been mistaken for calm. "I heard something against the gate. Not the wind, a hand perhaps, or something that wished to be one." Edward felt an odd tightening in his chest. Miss Marple had come to stand behind him. He had not heard her cross the room. "Gates," she said, as though contributing to a discussion of gardening, "are the most revealing things. In St. Mary Mead there was a Mr. Pritchard never closed his property, though he insisted that he did. It caused endless annoyance as chickens would wander in and out as they pleased. He was quite convinced that someone was interfering with him deliberately. It turned out, of course, that his memory had altered itself to suit his pride. He preferred to believe in sabotage rather than carelessness." Bellamy turned. "You suggest I have imagined this." "Oh no," said Miss Marple gently. "Only that what one hears at a gate is not always what one thinks one hears. Sound travels so oddly in enclosed places. A movement above may present itself as a movement beside. It is quite a trick of old buildings." Clara's eyes flickered, just for a moment, toward the upper windows. Edward followed the glance. The attic windows were small and set unevenly into the sloping roof. One of them, he noticed now, showed a faint smudge upon the inside of the glass, as though someone had brushed against it recently. "You see," Clara said quickly. "There, that is what I meant. Something has been moving about upstairs. Arthur, you cannot continue to ignore it." Bellamy's expression hardened. "I ignore nothing," he said. "I simply refuse to indulge nonsense. If there is someone in the attic, they have entered unlawfully and will be removed as such. If there is not, then this conversation ends here." Miss Marple clasped her hands. "Unlawful entry is such an interesting phrase," she said. "It assumes that the person entering has no right to be there. That is often true, of course, but not always. Sometimes the person feels they have every right indeed, and that it is the house that has wronged them." Bellamy's patience, already thin, seemed to fray further. "I must ask you," he said, "to refrain from these observations, Miss Marple. They are not helpful." "My dear Mr. Bellamy," she replied, "helpfulness is a matter of perspective. One never knows at the beginning of a situation what will prove useful at the end." Edward, who had been watching the attic window, became aware of movement again. This time it was clearer. Not a shape exactly, not a face, but the unmistakable suggestion of something passing across the glass. A dimming of light, a soft interruption, as though a figure had moved just behind it. Clara saw it too. Her hand tightened on the latch. "There!" she said, her voice lower now. "You cannot tell me that is nothing." Bellamy did not look up. Instead, he turned sharply and went back into the house. Edward hesitated, then followed Miss Marple just behind him. Inside, the air felt different. Not colder, precisely, but thinner, as though the room had been holding something that had now shifted elsewhere. Bellamy stood at the base of the staircase. The ladder Edward had noticed earlier rested against the shelves beside it, its polished rungs catching the dim light. "I will go up," Bellamy said. Clara stepped forward. "You should not go alone," she said. "There is no one," he replied, "and if there were, I would prefer not to involve an audience." Miss Marple tilted her head. "In my experience," she said, "people rarely wish for witnesses, unless they are entirely certain of what they will find." Bellamy ignored her. He placed his foot on the first stair. It creaked, not loudly, but distinctly, a note that seemed to carry through the entire house. Edward found himself holding his breath. Bellamy ascended slowly, each step measured, as though he were counting them. The staircase turned halfway up, disappearing from view before reaching the landing. For a moment there was nothing. Then a sound. Not from above, from the ladder. Edward turned. The ladder had shifted. Not much. Only enough that one of its feet had scraped slightly against the floor. Clara saw it at the same time. "That is absurd," she said, though there was no conviction in it. "It must be uneven. The boards here—" Miss Marple was looking not at the ladder itself, but at the space beside it. "How curious," she murmured. Edward followed her gaze. The shelf against which the ladder leaned held rows of books, orderly, precise, as everything in the shop seemed to be. But one volume, had been displaced, not removed, simply pushed back, as though someone had reached for it and then changed their mind, or as though something behind it had required space. Edward stepped closer. The faint scent he had noticed before, cloves or something like them, was stronger here. "Mr. Bellamy," he called, raising his voice slightly. "There is something." From above came a sudden sharp noise, a crash. Not large, not violent, but unmistakable. The sound of something falling, striking wood, then silence. Clara gasped. Bellamy's voice followed, strained now, stripped of its careful control. "Stay where you are," he called down. "Do not come up." Miss Marple moved, not toward the stairs, toward the ladder. She placed her hand upon one of the polished rungs and regarded it with quiet interest. "You see," she said, almost kindly, "how very much a ladder can tell one. It remembers every hand that has used it, every weight it has carried. People imagine such things are passive, but they are not. They keep a kind of account." Clara stared at her. "I do not understand what you mean." "No," said Miss Marple. "That is often the case at this stage." Edward looked from one to the other, then back toward the staircase. The house seemed to be listening, and somewhere above, something had changed. Chapter 4. The room above the truth. The sound of the object striking the floor upstairs did not echo as one might expect in an old house. It seemed, instead, to be absorbed, taken into the wood and held there, like a secret, pressed between pages. Edward became aware that no one moved for several seconds. Clara Hastings stood with one hand half raised, as though she had intended to reach for something and forgotten what. Miss Marple's fingers still rested lightly upon the ladder rung, her expression composed, though her eyes had sharpened to a brightness that suggested she had begun, quietly and thoroughly, to think. Above them, Arthur Bellamy did not speak again. "Mr. Bellamy," Edward called, a little more firmly this time. No reply. Clara drew in a breath that was not quite steady. "He should not have gone alone," she said, her voice controlled but strained at the edges. "This is precisely what I meant. There is something wrong in this house, and he insists on treating it as if it were a matter of dust and catalogues." Miss Marple removed her hand from the ladder. "My dear," she said gently, "there are many kinds of wrongness. Some are structural, some are personal. One must take care not to confuse the two, though houses do encourage it." Clara turned toward her with a flash of impatience. "You speak as though this were a puzzle to be admired. It is not. It is a disturbance. It has been happening for days now. Things moved, sounds at night, that dreadful—" She stopped herself, pressing her lips together. "That dreadful," Miss Marple prompted softly. Clara shook her head. "It does not matter. Arthur dislikes it being discussed, and I have no wish to distress him further." Edward found that curious. "What has been happening exactly?" he asked. "If there have been disturbances, perhaps there is some simple explanation." Clara gave a faint, almost apologetic smile. "There are always explanations," she said. "The difficulty lies in choosing which one to believe." She moved toward the foot of the stairs, then paused. "I think we must go up," she said. "Whatever Arthur's preferences, we cannot leave him there without knowing what has happened." Miss Marple inclined her head. "That seems very sensible." Edward followed as Clara placed her foot upon the first step. The staircase complained in the same measured way Bellamy's ascent had produced, each board giving a soft, deliberate note, as though acknowledging the passage of weight. Halfway up, the turn in the stairs narrowed the space so that Clara had to brush one shoulder lightly against the wall. Edward noticed, absurdly, that the wallpaper here bore a different pattern, small, repeating flowers in faded red, almost worn away by years of contact. At the top, the landing opened suddenly. The ceiling sloped sharply, and the air held the unmistakable dryness of a place long closed to regular use. A single lamp had been lit, Edward did not know by whom, and its glow was weak, throwing shadows that seemed to move when one did not look directly at them. Arthur Bellamy stood near the far wall. He had not fallen. That, Edward realized at once, was important. The crash had not been his doing. Instead, a small wooden stool lay overturned beside him. One leg cracked where it had struck the floor. Bellamy himself was quite still, not frozen, held, as though whatever he was looking at had arrested him completely. Clara moved past Edward at once. "Arthur, what is it? What has happened?" He did not answer her. Miss Marple came up behind them, her steps light, despite the narrowness of the stairs. She paused at the top, taking in the room with a single, comprehensive glance. The attic was larger than Edward had expected, though much of it was given over to storage. Boxes, crates, stacks of books, tied in twine, all arranged with the same careful order that governed the shop below. A narrow table stood beneath the small window Edward had noticed from the courtyard, and upon it several candles had been placed. Lit. That was the first thing that struck him. Lit, though no one had mentioned lighting. Their flames were steady, casting a soft, wavering light across the room, and in that light something moved. Edward's breath caught. Not a person, not entirely, but a shape, pale, indistinct, shifting at the edge of sight, a suggestion of form that appeared, disappeared, and appeared again as the candlelight flickered. Clara gasped, this time without restraint. "There," she whispered. "You see it. You must see it now." Bellamy closed his eyes briefly. "Yes," he said, "I see it." His voice was not fearful. It was resigned. Miss Marple did not look at the shape. She looked at the candles. "How very careful," she murmured. "How very precise indeed." Edward turned to her. "You do not find this remarkable?" she said. "Oh, I find it extremely so, but not, I think, for the reason you mean." Clara stared at her. "You cannot possibly suggest that this is ordinary. That is not a trick of light." It is a trick of light," Miss Marple said gently, "though not, I think, an accidental one." Bellamy's eyes opened. He looked at her for the first time since they had entered the room. "You are mistaken," he said. "This has occurred without intervention. The candles were not lit when I last came up here." Miss Marple smiled. "My dear Mr. Bellamy, candles do not light themselves. That is one of the few reliable truths in life. The question is not whether someone lit them, but why they chose to arrange them in this particular fashion." Edward looked again. The candles were not placed randomly. They formed a loose arc along the edge of the table, their light angled toward the centre of the room, and beyond them, set slightly back, a small mirror, not convex like the one below, flat, positioned so that the candlelight struck it at an angle. Edward felt something shift in his understanding. The shape, the figure, was not in the room. It was reflected, or projected. Something, somewhere, was being cast into view. Clara shook her head. "This is absurd," she said. "You are trying to explain away something that is plainly not. Plainly not what it appears to be," Miss Marple suggested. "Yes, that is often the case." She stepped forward, moving past Bellamy, with a quiet assurance that seemed to unsettle him more than any disturbance could have done. "May I?" she asked, though she did not wait for an answer. She adjusted one of the candles slightly. The effect was immediate. The pale shape shifted, altered. For a moment it vanished entirely. Then, as the flame steadied, it reappeared, but not in the same place. Edward felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "That is," he began. "Deliberate," Miss Marple said. "Entirely deliberate. One must stand in a very particular position to see it as it was intended. A little to the left, perhaps, or a step further back." She glanced at Bellamy. "Were you standing there, my dear Mr. Bellamy, when you first saw it?" He did not answer. Clara looked between them. "What are you implying?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Only that this is not haunting," she said. "It is a message, and messages, in my experience, are always meant for someone specific." Bellamy turned away abruptly. "This is nonsense," he said. "Who would construct such a thing? And for what purpose?" Miss Marple regarded him with quiet interest. "That," she said, "is precisely what we must consider. Though I cannot help thinking that the purpose may already be known to at least one person in this room." Clara stiffened. "Surely you do not mean—" But before she could finish, Edward noticed something else. On the table, beside the candles, a book, the same slim volume he had taken from the shelf below. The blank book, except it was no longer blank. One page lay open, and upon it, in a hand that seemed at once careful and hurried, a single line had been written. Edward stepped closer, drawn despite himself. "What does it say?" Clara asked. He hesitated, then read aloud. "You cannot keep it hidden forever." Silence followed. "Not empty. Waited." Miss Marple looked at the words, then at Bellamy. "How very unfortunate," she said softly. "Secrets do not like being arranged. They have a way of slipping out of their proper place." Bellamy's face had gone pale again, not with fear, with something else. And Edward understood, with a sudden clarity that unsettled him more than the shifting figure had done. This was not the beginning of something. It was the continuation of something that had already gone much too far. And whatever had been hidden was now determined to be seen. Chapter 5. What was meant to be seen. No one spoke for several seconds after Edward read the words aloud. It was not the silence of uncertainty, but of recognition, though not, perhaps, shared recognition. Clara Hastings stood with her back slightly turned, as though distancing herself from the table might also distance her from the message. Arthur Bellamy had not moved at all. His gaze remained fixed, not on the writing itself, but on the lower corner of the page, where the ink had pooled faintly before drying. Miss Marple, on the other hand, leaned forward, not eagerly, not dramatically, simply with the quiet attention of someone examining a small domestic matter that others had made unnecessarily complicated. "How curious," she said. "The pen must have been held rather tightly. One can see where the nib pressed a little too firmly. People do that when they are writing quickly, but also when they are writing something they have considered for a long time." Clara turned sharply. "You speak as though you know who wrote it." "My dear," Miss Marple replied gently, "I know nothing of the kind, but I have found that the manner in which something is done often tells one more than the act itself." Bellamy's voice came then, low and controlled. "This is intolerable." He stepped forward and closed the book with a quick, decisive motion, as though the act of shutting it might undo what had been written. "It is some vulgar trick," he continued, "an intrusion. I will not have my house made into a stage for this sort of performance." Clara faced him fully now. "Then explain it," she said. "Explain the candles. Explain the writing. Explain the—" She gestured toward the shifting light where the pale form had been. "You cannot simply dismiss it because it is inconvenient." Bellamy's mouth tightened. "I dismiss it because it is absurd." Miss Marple, who had moved a fraction closer to the table, touched one of the candles lightly, adjusting its position once more. The pale form shifted again. This time it stretched, elongated, becoming something almost like a figure leaning forward. Edward felt a strange sensation, as though the room itself had altered slightly in proportion. "It is not absurd," Miss Marple said quietly. "It is very carefully done, which makes it, I think, quite serious indeed." She straightened and looked around the attic. "One always finds," she continued, "that when something has been arranged with this degree of care, it is not intended for general effect. It is meant to be understood by one particular person." Clara folded her arms. "And you believe that person is Arthur?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I believe," she said, "that Mr. Bellamy understands this better than either of us." Bellamy's composure faltered, just for a moment. "That is nonsense," he said. "I have no idea what this is supposed to mean." Miss Marple regarded him kindly. "No," she said, "that is not quite true." Edward, who had been studying the table, noticed something else. The candle wax. It had not dripped randomly. Each candle had burned just enough to leave a small pool at its base. None of them long enough to suggest they had been lit hours ago, none so short as to be newly placed. They had been lit recently, and with purpose. He spoke without thinking. "Someone must have been here just before we came up." Clara turned to him. "That is precisely what I have been saying. Someone has been moving about the house, and Arthur insists on treating it as if it were a matter of drafts and loose boards." Bellamy shook his head. "No one could have entered without my knowledge. The doors are locked. The windows are secured. There is no access to this room except by the stairs." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Unless," she said, "one was already inside." The words settled into the room with quiet weight. Clara laughed, though there was no humour in it. "That is ridiculous. You suggest that someone has been hiding here in the attic? For days?" Miss Marple did not answer at once. Instead, she walked slowly across the room, her gaze moving over the boxes, the stacked books, the narrow spaces between them. "In St. Mary Mead," she said after a moment, "there was a young man named Peter Hargreaves who wished very much to avoid a certain conversation with his father. He found the simplest solution was to remove himself entirely from the house, except that he did not, in fact, go anywhere. He remained in the loft above the stables for 3 days, quite comfortably, living on apples and a jar of honey he had taken up with him. His mother was convinced he had run away. His father was convinced he had done something dreadful. In the end, of course, the truth was far more ordinary, and yet, for those 3 days, the entire household rearranged itself around a misunderstanding." Clara frowned. "You think this is a misunderstanding?" Miss Marple's eyes moved to the table again. "No," she said softly. "I think it is something that wishes to be understood." Edward felt that same unease return, the sense that everything in the room was to connect, though the connections themselves remained just out of reach. He looked at the book, at the closed cover beneath Bellamy's hand. "You said it was unfinished," he said. Bellamy glanced at him. "What?" "The book," Edward continued. "You said it was unfinished, but someone has written in it now. That suggests it was meant to be written in. Bellamy's expression hardened. It suggests nothing of the kind. It is an old ledger. Nothing more. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened slightly. A ledger? She repeated. How interesting. One does not often see ledgers kept among first editions. They tend to be rather more practical objects. It is of no importance, Bellamy said quickly. A remnant of earlier business. I keep it only because it would be inconvenient to discard it. Miss Marple smiled. Inconvenience is such a powerful motive for keeping things, she said, though I have observed that what people call inconvenience is often something else entirely. Clara moved toward the stairs. I have had enough of this, she said. If there is someone in the house, we must find them. If there is not, then we must at least establish how this contrivance has been managed. She descended before anyone could reply. Edward hesitated, then followed. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, he became aware of the shop again, the familiar scent of paper and polish, the quiet arrangement of books, the bell above the door that had seemed so ordinary when he first entered. Now everything feels altered, not changed, revealed. Miss Marple came down last. She paused beside the ladder once more, her fingers brushing lightly against one of the rungs. You see, she said almost to herself, how very consistent it is. The polish here, the wear there. Someone has been using this more often than one would expect. Edward looked. She was right. The middle rungs bore the most wear, not the lower ones as one might assume, as though whoever used it did not begin at the bottom, but at a particular height. Clara's voice came from the front of the shop. The door, she said. Arthur, the front door. Edward turned. The door stood open, not wide, just enough, and the bell above it was still. Miss Marple's gaze moved slowly from the door to the shelves, to the mirror in the corner, and finally to the place where the blank book had stood before it was taken upstairs. My dear, she said quietly, I believe we are being asked a question. Edward swallowed. What kind of question? Miss Marple smiled faintly. The kind, she said, that already knows the answer. Chapter 6. The position of things. The open door did not swing or creak. It simply remained where it was, as though it had been placed there deliberately, like a bookmark, in a page one intended to return to. Clara Hastings crossed the room quickly and pushed it shut with more force than necessary. The bell above gave a single, thin note, then settled. There, she said, though the word carried no sense of resolution. That is precisely the sort of thing I mean. Doors do not open themselves. Miss Marple, who had remained near the ladder, did not contradict her. No, she said thoughtfully, they do not, but they do sometimes open for reasons other than the obvious. A draught, for instance, or a habit. People forget how often they leave things slightly undone, and then attribute the result to something far more interesting. Clara turned back, her composure fraying again. You are determined to make everything ordinary, she said, even when it is not. My dear, Miss Marple replied gently, the extraordinary is almost always constructed out of very ordinary pieces. One simply has to notice how they have been arranged. Arthur Bellamy had not moved from the foot of the stairs. His gaze had gone to the shelves, specifically to the place where the blank book had been taken from earlier. It should not have been left there, he murmured. Edward, who had been watching him, said, You mean the ledger. Bellamy gave a brief, sharp nod. It has no place among the stock, he said. It was a temporary measure. I intended to move it. Miss Marple looked at him with mild interest. One always intends to move things, she said, and yet they remain rather stubbornly where they are. It is one of the ways in which the past insists upon itself. Clara exhaled. This is going nowhere, she said. We must search the house properly. Every room, every cupboard. If someone has been here, if someone is still here, then we will find them. Bellamy's mouth tightened. There is no one here, he said again, though now the words sounded less like certainty and more like insistence. Edward found himself speaking before he had quite formed the thought. Then how do you explain the candles? He asked. Or the writing? Or the figure we saw? Bellamy turned to him. With difficulty, he said, but that does not alter the fact that there is an explanation. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said softly, there always is. She moved toward the front of the shop, stopping beneath the small convex mirror that hung in the corner. She looked up at it, then adjusted her position slightly. One step to the left, then another half step back. Edward watched her reflection shift. What do you see? He asked. Miss Marple did not answer at once. Instead, she gestured for him to stand where she had been. Here, my dear, she said. Just there, yes. That is it. Edward took the position. At first, he saw only the distorted curve of the room, the shelves, bending inward, the ladder stretched into something almost elegant. Then, the landing, visible in the mirror in a way it was not from any other angle, and on that landing something pale, still. He drew in a breath. "It is there again," he said. Clara moved beside him. "I told you," she said quickly. "You cannot explain that away." Miss Marple stepped slightly to one side. "Now," she said, "move just a little. No, not forward, backward. Yes, that is quite right." Edward did so. The pale shape vanished completely. He blinked. "It's gone," he said. Clara frowned. "That is impossible." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not impossible," she said. "Merely precise." She looked at Bellamy. "You see," she continued, "how very particular it is. One must stand in exactly the right place to observe it. A step too far in either direction, and it disappears entirely." Bellamy said nothing. His silence, Edward thought, was beginning to feel less like resistance and more like knowledge. Clara shook her head. "So what are you suggesting?" she demanded. "That someone has arranged mirrors and candles and shadows simply to frighten us?" Miss Marple considered this. "Not us," she said. "No, I do not think we are the intended audience at all." Edward felt that again the quiet shift in understanding, the sense that something had been placed before them not to confuse, but to communicate. "To frighten Mr. Bellamy," he said slowly. Miss Marple's eyes warmed. "Yes," she said. "That seems much more likely." Clara turned sharply to Bellamy. "Arthur, what does that mean? Who would wish to frighten you?" Bellamy's expression did not change, but something in his posture altered, a slight tightening, a withdrawal. "No one," he said. Miss Marple looked at him with gentle curiosity. "That is a very absolute answer," she said, "and absolute answers are so rarely accurate." Clara stepped closer to him. "This has gone far enough," she said. "If there is something you have not told me, something that might explain this, then you must say so now." Bellamy's gaze flickered toward the shelves again. "There is nothing to tell," he said. Miss Marple turned away from him and moved toward the table near the front window, the one where they had taken tea earlier. She lifted one of the cups. There was a faint mark along its rim, a trace of something darker than tea. She held it to the light, then set it down again. "How very odd," she murmured. Edward approached her. "What is it?" she smiled. "Oh, nothing of consequence, perhaps. Only that the cup has been used twice, though I do not recall anyone taking a second cup from it." Clara frowned. "That is ridiculous. I brought the tray myself. I know exactly how many." She stopped. Edward saw it then, a second cup. Not on the tray. On the edge of the table, half hidden behind a stack of books. It had not been there before. "I did not put that there," Clara said, her voice suddenly very quiet. Miss Marple nodded. "No," she said. "I do not think you did." Edward looked toward the stairs. "If someone is in the house, they are not moving randomly," Miss Marple said. "That is the important thing. Everything that has happened has been placed. The ladder, the candles, the book, even the door." She paused. "And now, the cup." Clara's hands had begun to tremble, though she clasped them together quickly. "This is intolerable," she said. "I will not remain here while someone plays these games." Miss Marple regarded her kindly. "My dear," she said, "it is not a game. That is precisely the point." She turned back to the mirror. "Everything has been arranged to be seen from a particular position. Not just physically, but emotionally, if one might put it that way. The person responsible wishes for something to be understood." Edward felt a slow, creeping realization. "The message," he said. "The writing in the book." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "That was not the beginning. It was a continuation." Bellamy's voice came then, sharper than before. "This is absurd," he said. "You are building a narrative out of nothing. There is no message. There is no intention. There is only—" He stopped. Miss Marple turned to him. "Only what?" she asked gently. Bellamy did not answer. Instead he looked at the second cup, and for the first time since Edward had met him, there was something unmistakable in his expression. Not irritation, not control, fear. Miss Marple followed his gaze. "Ah," she said quietly, "that is interesting." Edward looked between them. "What is?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "My dear," she said, "it is not the cup itself that matters. It is the fact that Mr. Bellamy knows something about it that we do not." Clara stepped back. "You are suggesting that Arthur—" "I am suggesting nothing," Miss Marple said, "only observing." She moved once more toward the ladder, her fingers brushing the polished rung. "One always finds," she continued, "that when things are placed with such care, they are meant to lead one somewhere. The difficulty is not in seeing them, but in understanding where they point." Edward followed her gaze. The ladder, the mirror, The stairs, the table, the door. Each object, each position, connected, and suddenly he saw it, not clearly, not completely, but enough. They all lead upward, he said. Miss Marple smiled. Yes, she said. I believe they do. Clara shook her head. This is madness. Miss Marple looked at her kindly. No, she said. It is the intention. She turned toward the stairs once more. And I think, she added softly, that we have not yet seen the most important part of it. Edward felt a chill settle over him. Upstairs? He asked. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said, though not perhaps in the way we expect. Bellamy closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the control had returned, but only just. You will not go up again, he said. I will not permit it. Miss Marple smiled. My dear Mr. Bellamy, she said gently, permission is a very curious thing. It matters so much less when the question has already been asked. Edward looked at the staircase, at the turning point where the view vanished, and he understood with a certainty that unsettled him deeply. Whatever had been arranged in that attic was not finished. Chapter 7. Everything that was not, said. Clara Hastings refused to look at the staircase. That, more than anything she had said, struck Edward as significant. A person genuinely frightened glances again and again toward the source of fear, drawn by it despite themselves. Clara, instead, kept her eyes firmly on the room before her, as though by doing so she might reduce the existence of what lay above to something manageable. I think, she said with deliberate composure, that we are all allowing ourselves to be carried away. There are explanations for everything that has occurred. There must be. Miss Marple, who had settled once more into her chair by the small tea-table, folded her hands in her lap. Yes, she said, there must, though I have always found that the difficulty lies not in the existence of explanations, but in their arrangement. Clara exhaled sharply. What does that mean? It means, Miss Marple replied gently, that one may have all the necessary pieces and still fail to see the picture they form. People are very fond of looking at things individually. It feels safer. Arthur Bellamy moved abruptly. Enough, he said. This has gone far enough. I will not have my house dissected in this manner. Whatever has been done here, whoever is responsible, I will deal with it. Clara turned toward him. And how do you propose to do that? She asked. By ignoring it. By pretending it does not exist. Bellamy's jaw tightened. By restoring order, he said, which is more than can be said for this. Speculation. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Order is the most admirable aim, she said, though it is sometimes achieved by removing what is inconvenient rather than by understanding it. That can lead to unfortunate consequences. Bellamy did not reply. Instead, he crossed the room and began adjusting the shelves, straightening volumes that were already straight, aligning edges that did not require alignment. It was not tidying, it was avoidance. Edward watched him for a moment, then turned back to Miss Marple. You said earlier, he began, that this was a message, that it was meant for someone specific. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, I believe so. And that someone is Mr. Bellamy? I think it is very likely, she said. Clara shook her head. This is absurd, she said again, though now the word sounded thinner, less certain. Who would go to such lengths? Mirrors, candles, writing in a book. What purpose could that possibly serve? Miss Marple considered this. Insane. Mary Mead, she said after a moment. There was a woman named Agnes Tilbury who wished very much to remind her sister of something that had been conveniently forgotten. She did not confront her directly. Oh no, that would have been far too simple. Instead, she rearranged the sitting room, moved a photograph here, a chair there, placed a particular book upon the table. Nothing obvious, nothing that could be objected to. But when her sister entered the room, she found herself surrounded by small reminders. Things she could not quite ignore, though she could not explain them either. It was most effective. Within a week, the matter had been addressed. Edward frowned. You mean this is not meant to frighten? It is meant to remind me. Miss Marple's eyes warmed. Yes, she said softly. That seems much more likely. Clara looked at Bellamy. Arthur, she said, her voice quieter now. Is there something you have not told me? Bellamy did not turn. There is nothing to tell, he said. Miss Marple sighed very gently. My dear Mr. Bellamy, she said, that is rarely the case. There is almost always something to tell. The question is whether one chooses to tell it before or after it becomes unavoidable. Edward became aware of something else then. The smell. It had changed. Not entirely, but enough. The faint trace of cloves, or whatever it was, had grown stronger again. He looked toward the ladder. Do you smell that? He asked. Clara frowned. Smell what? That, he hesitated, trying to find the right word. That sharp scent. It's stronger than before, Miss Marple rose. Yes, she said. "It is. How very interesting." She moved toward the ladder once more, her steps unhurried. Edward followed. The scent was indeed stronger here, more distinct now, less easily dismissed as something vague or imagined. "It comes from above," he said. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. And yet it is noticeable here as well. That suggests it is being encouraged to travel." Clara looked at her sharply. "Encouraged? How can a scent be encouraged?" Miss Marple touched the rung of the ladder again. "By air," she said. "By warmth, by movement. Old houses are full of little pathways one does not immediately see. A door left slightly ajar, a crack in the floorboards, a space behind a shelf. All of these allow things to move from one place to another." Edward glanced at the shelves, at the one where the blank book had been, at the slight displacement Miss Marple had noticed earlier. "You think there's a space behind there?" he said. Miss Marple smiled. "I think there might be," she said, "and I think it might be connected to the attic in some way." Clara stepped back. "That is impossible," she said. "This house has been here for centuries. If there were such a passage, someone would have known." Miss Marple's expression remained gentle. "My dear," she said, "people often live in houses for years without knowing them at all. One becomes accustomed to what one sees, and ceases to question it. It is only when something changes, something small perhaps, that one begins to notice what has always been there." Bellamy turned then. "There is no passage," he said sharply. "I would know if there were." Miss Marple regarded him with quiet interest. "Yes," she said. "You would." The words hung in the air. Edward felt a subtle shift in the room, something unspoken but understood. Clara's voice broke the silence. "Arthur," she said, "you are not telling us everything." Bellamy looked at her. For a moment, the careful arrangement of his expression faltered completely. "You are mistaken," he said. Miss Marple tilted her head. "In St. Mary Mead," she said softly, "there was a gentleman named Colonel Davenant who insisted, for many years, that there was no key to a certain locked cupboard in his study. He was quite adamant about it. The cupboard remained locked, and no one questioned it, until one day, quite by accident, the key was found in the lining of his coat. He had not lost it, you see. He had simply chosen not to remember where it was." Clara stared at Bellamy. "What does that mean?" she asked. Miss Marple's gaze remained on him. "It means," she said gently, "that knowing and admitting are not always the same thing." Bellamy said nothing. Edward looked again at the ladder, at the shelves, at the faint gap behind the displaced book, and suddenly the arrangement of things seemed clearer, not complete, but closer. "They're not just leading upward," he said slowly. "They're leading through." Miss Marple smiled. "Yes," she said. "I believe they are." Clara shook her head. "This is madness," she said again, though now the words sounded almost like a plea. Miss Marple turned to her kindly. "No," she said. "It is design." She stepped closer to the shelf and without hesitation reached for the book that had been pushed back earlier. Edward held his breath. "Miss Marple," he began. She pulled the book free. Behind it a gap, not large, but unmistakable, a narrow space between the shelf and the wall, and from that space the scent, stronger now, clearer, and something else, a faint movement of air. Clara stared. "That cannot be." Miss Marple leaned closer, peering into the darkness. "How very interesting," she murmured. Edward felt his pulse quicken. "What is it?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached out and touched the edge of the shelf. Then very gently she pressed. There was a soft click, and the entire section of shelving shifted. Not much, just enough. Enough to reveal a narrow opening, dark, silent, leading somewhere beyond. Clara took a step back. "No," she said. "No, that is not possible." Miss Marple turned to her. "My dear," she said gently, "I think we have just found where the question is coming from." Edward looked into the darkness, and understood with a sudden, undeniable certainty. They had not been alone in the house, not at any point, and whatever had been arranging things had been very close indeed. Chapter 8. The space between shelves, no one spoke at first. The opening behind the shelf did not seem large enough to account for what had been happening, and yet its presence altered the entire meaning of the house. It was not the sort of concealed passage one saw in sensational tales, with broad steps and hidden rooms. It was narrow, practical, almost mean in its dimensions, as though intended not for comfort, but for necessity. Edward felt an instinctive reluctance to move closer, though he could not have said why. Clara Hastings had retreated at a pace, one hand lifted unconsciously toward her throat. "That cannot have been there," she said. "Not all this time. Arthur, you must have known." "Arthur." Bellamy did not answer. He stood very still, looking at the opening. And Edward saw again that expression, not fear exactly, but something that bordered on it. Recognition, perhaps, or the moment just before it. Miss Marple, by contrast, leaned slightly forward. "How very useful," she said. "A passage like this. One can move quite freely without being observed. Upwards, I think, as well as along." Edward forced himself to look more carefully. The space did not end immediately. It extended inward at an angle, just wide enough for a person to pass sideways. The walls rough, where the timber framing had been left exposed. A faint line of dust had been disturbed along the lower edge, as though something or someone had passed there recently. "It leads upstairs," he said quietly. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes," she said, "I believe it does. And most likely to the attic, though not by the route we have been using." Clara's voice sharpened. "You mean someone has been going up and down without using the stairs? That they have been moving through the house without our knowledge?" Miss Marple turned her head slightly. "My dear, I think that is precisely what has been happening." Clara shook her head, though her denial had lost its earlier conviction. "But who?" she demanded. "And why? What possible reason could there be for—" She stopped. Edward followed her gaze. Bellamy had moved, not toward the opening, away from it. A small step only, but unmistakable. Miss Marple noticed it too. "How very interesting," she said softly. "One might almost suppose that the passage is not new to you, Mr. Bellamy." Bellamy's face hardened. "I have never seen that before," he said. Miss Marple regarded him kindly. "No," she said, "you have not seen it. That is not quite the same thing." Clara turned to him sharply. "Arthur, there is nothing to say," he interrupted. "Old houses contain oddities. That does not mean they are significant." Miss Marple's eyes moved from him to the opening again. "On the contrary," she said, "they are often very significant indeed, especially when they are being used." Edward became aware of the faintest sound from within the passage. Not a footstep, not a voice. Something lighter, a movement of air perhaps, or fabric brushing against wood. He held his breath. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Clara's hand tightened against her throat. "Yes," she said. "There is someone in there." Bellamy did not move. Miss Marple remained perfectly still. Then, quite gently, she spoke. "My dear," she said, her voice directed not at any of them, but into the narrow darkness. "You have made your presence very clear. There is no need to continue in this manner. We are quite ready to listen." Silence followed, not empty, listening. Edward felt the strange sensation again that the house itself had become aware of them, of their attention, of their understanding. Clara stepped back another pace. "This is intolerable," she said. "We cannot simply stand here and—" She broke off. A shadow shifted within the passage. This time there was no mistaking it. Something moved, slowly, deliberately, toward the opening. Edward felt his pulse quicken. "Who is there?" he called, though his voice came out lower than he intended. The movement stopped. Miss Marple did not raise her voice. "There is no advantage in concealment now," she said gently. "The arrangement has been understood. The question has been asked. It remains only to answer it." For a moment, nothing happened. Then a hand appeared. Not suddenly, not dramatically, simply there, resting against the edge of the opening. Pale, steady, Edward stared. Clara let out a small, involuntary sound. The hand tightened slightly, as though testing the solidity of the shelf, and then a figure emerged. Not a ghost, not an illusion, a person, a woman. She stepped out of the narrow passage with care, turning sideways to avoid the edge of the shelf, then straightened slowly. She was older than Clara, though not by much, perhaps in her late 40s. Her hair was dark, threaded with grey, and drawn back in a way that suggested long habit rather than vanity. Her clothes were plain, practical, and carried the faint dust of the passage with them. She looked at them, not with fear, not with defiance, with something else entirely, recognition. "Well," she said, her voice quiet but clear, "that has taken rather longer than I expected." Clara stared at her. "I do not know you," she said. The woman inclined her head slightly. "No," she said. "I did not think you would." Her gaze moved past Clara, to Bellamy. He had not moved, not since she appeared. The careful arrangement of his expression had collapsed entirely now. "Arthur," the woman said. His name hung in the air, not as a greeting, as a statement. Bellamy swallowed. "You should not be here," he said. The woman smiled faintly. "That," she replied, "depends on one's point of view." Miss Marple watched them both with quiet interest. "Insaint." "Mary Mead," she said softly. "There was a woman who returned to a house she had once left in great distress. The new occupants did not recognize her, of course, but the house did. It had kept a sort of memory of her, where she had stood, what she had touched. It made for a most uncomfortable situation, though not, I think, for the reasons one might expect. Clara looked between them. "Arthur," she said, her voice rising slightly. "Who is this?" Bellamy did not answer. The woman answered instead. "My name," she said, "is Margaret Bellamy." Clara blinked. "Bellamy?" she repeated. The woman nodded. "Yes," she said. "I believe that was my name before it became inconvenient." The words settled heavily. Edward felt a shift in the entire room, a reordering of everything that had come before. Miss Marple folded her hands. "How very interesting," she said. Clara turned to Bellamy again. "Arthur, what is she talking about?" Bellamy's voice, when it came, was barely controlled. "You left," he said, "years ago. You have no right to be here." Margaret Bellamy's smile did not change. "No right," she said. "That is a curious word, Arthur. One might almost suppose that you had decided it yourself." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Yes," she said softly. "That is often how such things happen." Edward looked at the narrow passage, on the shelf, at the ladder, at the careful arrangement of everything, and he understood at last the shape of it. Not completely, not yet, but enough. "This wasn't meant to frighten," he said. Miss Marple smiled. "No," she said. "I do not think it was." Clara shook her head, trying to regain her footing. "Then what was it meant to do?" Miss Marple's gaze moved from Margaret Bellamy to Arthur. "My dear," she said gently, "I believe it was meant to make something impossible to ignore." Margaret's eyes did not leave Bellamy. "Yes," she said quietly, "that was precisely the intention." The room seemed to hold its breath, and Edward realized this was not the revelation. It was only the beginning of it. Chapter 9. What was written before? For a long moment no one moved. Margaret Bellamy stood just beyond the shelf, the dust of the hidden passage still faintly clinging to her sleeves, as though she had stepped not only out of a confined space, but out of a version of time that had been kept deliberately out of sight. Arthur Bellamy faced her without advancing, without retreating, as though any movement might settle something he had spent years refusing to name. Clara Hastings was the first to break. "This is absurd," she said, though the word no longer carried force, only strain. "Arthur, you cannot simply stand there. If this woman is, if she claims to be, my wife," Margaret said, without raising her voice. Clara faltered. "That is impossible." "Not at all," Margaret replied, "only inconvenient." Miss Marple, who had taken up her seat again, as though this were the natural progression of a rather interesting afternoon, folded her hands. "One does dislike the word inconvenient," she said gently. "It covers such a multitude of decisions." Arthur Bellamy's gaze did not shift. "You left," he said again, as though repetition might restore the certainty of it. "You walked out of this house without a word, without an address, without—" "I left," Margaret said, "because I was told I had no place in it." The words were simple. They landed with more weight than any raised voice could have carried. Clara looked sharply between them. "Arthur, what does she mean?" He did not answer her. Margaret stepped further into the room, her eyes moving once, briefly, over the shelves, the table, the mirror. "So little has changed," she said. "You have always preferred arrangement to alteration. It gives the impression of control." Miss Marple nodded faintly. "Yes," she said. "Arrangement is a very powerful thing. One can move objects about until they tell a different story entirely." Edward felt the meaning of that settle somewhere just beyond his immediate grasp. Margaret turned toward the table where the book lay. "You found it, I see," she said. Arthur's voice was sharp. "You had no right to touch that." Margaret looked at him. "No right," she repeated. "It was my hand that began it." Clara's breath caught. "The book," she said. "The ledger, you mean?" "Yes," Margaret said. "The ledger." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened almost imperceptibly. "How very interesting," she murmured. Arthur stepped forward. "That book is nothing," he said. "An old account. Irrelevant." Margaret smiled faintly. "Is it?" she said. "Then you will not object if it is read." He stopped, not abruptly, but enough. Miss Marple observed this with quiet attention. "In St. Mary Mead," she said, as though recalling a trivial matter, "there was a gentleman who insisted that a certain drawer in his desk contained nothing of interest. He was quite firm about it. No one paid it much attention until, of course, it became clear that he was the only person who felt the need to mention it at all." Clara looked at Arthur. "You have said nothing about this book," she said slowly. "Not once." Arthur did not answer. Margaret reached for the ledger. Her movements were unhurried, almost deliberate in their calmness. She opened it to the page Edward had seen before, where the single line had been written. "You cannot keep it hidden forever." She turned another page, then another. The paper did not have the feel of something newly written. Some of the ink had faded slightly, as though it had been there for years. Other entries were fresher, more recent. Edward leaned closer. "It isn't blank at all," he said. "No," Margaret replied. "It never was." Clara stepped forward. "What is it?" she asked. "What does it contain?" Margaret looked at her for the first time with something approaching kindness. She said, "Transactions, ownerships, transfers." Arthur's voice cut in. "It contains nothing of consequence." Margaret did not look at him. "It contains everything," she said quietly. Miss Marple rose. "May I?" she asked. Margaret inclined her head. "Of course." Miss Marple took the book and examined it with the same gentle attention she had given to the teacups, the ladder, the mirror. "Ah," she said softly. "Yes. One can see it at once. The changes in the hand, the differences in the ink. Entries begun by one person, continued by another." Clara frowned. "I do not understand." Miss Marple turned a page. "My dear," she said, "this is not merely a ledger of books. It is a record of adjustments." "Adjustments?" Clara repeated. "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Of provenance, perhaps. Of ownership. Of what was acquired, and how it was presented thereafter." Edward felt a slow, dawning clarity. "You mean—" he began. Margaret finished for him. "Some of the books in this shop," she said, "are not what they claim to be." Clara stared. "That is ridiculous. Arthur would never." Arthur spoke over her. "They are legitimate acquisitions," he said. "Every one of them." Margaret's smile did not change. "Yes," she said. "Eventually." The word hung there. "Eventually." Miss Marple closed the book gently. "How very unfortunate," she said, "when things are made to appear older than they are, or more valuable, or more respectable. It is always so difficult to maintain the illusion over time." Arthur's composure fractured. "This is absurd," he said. "You have no proof, nothing that would stand against." Margaret interrupted him. "I have the original entries," she said. "The ones you removed." Silence. Clara turned slowly toward him. "Arthur, what is she saying?" He did not answer. Miss Marple regarded him with quiet sympathy. "My dear Mr. Bellamy," she said, "it is always the earlier version of things that causes difficulty. People are quite comfortable with a revised story until they are reminded of what came before." Edward looked at Margaret. "That is why you came back," he said. "Not to frighten him. To make him remember." Margaret nodded. "Yes," she said, "and to make it impossible for him not to." Clara shook her head. "This cannot be true," she said. "Arthur has built this business, this reputation, over decades. You are suggesting—" "I am stating," Margaret said, "that some of that reputation rests on things that were never entirely as they appeared." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes," she said, "appearances are such fragile constructions. One small disturbance, and the whole arrangement begins to shift." Arthur stepped back. "You have no right," he said again, though now the words sounded less like accusation and more like defence. Margaret looked at him steadily. "I have every right," she said, "because I was there at the beginning. I saw what was done, helped to record it." Clara's voice trembled. "Arthur, tell me this is not true." He said nothing, and in that silence the answer settled. Miss Marple closed the ledger once more and placed her hand lightly upon it. "In St. Mary Mead," she said softly, "there was a man who built a most admirable garden wall. Straight, strong, beautifully finished. Everyone admired it. It was only when a storm came that we discovered the foundation had been laid on loose ground. The wall did not collapse immediately. It shifted, just a little at first. But that was enough. Edward felt the meaning of that. Not collapse. Shift." Margaret looked at Arthur. "I did not come to destroy you," she said quietly. "I came to make you tell the truth." Arthur laughed then, not with humour, with something close to desperation. "And if I refuse?" he said. Margaret met his gaze. "Then the arrangement continues," she said, "until it cannot." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes," she said, "that is usually how such things proceed." Edward looked at the room again, the ladder, the mirror, the passage, the candles above, all of it arranged, not to frighten, not even to expose, but to lead to this moment. And he understood with a clarity that unsettled him. This was not about the past. It was about what would happen next. Chapter 10. The Woman Who Poured Two. Carefully Miss Marple did not speak at once. That, Edward noticed, was her habit at moments of greatest significance. Not to interrupt, not to impose, but to allow the silence to settle until it revealed something of its own accord. The ledger lay closed beneath her hand, and yet its presence seemed to fill the room more completely than any object had a right to do. Clara Hastings stood quite still. Her composure, so carefully maintained until now, had begun to show fine fractures, hairline at first, then widening with every unspoken implication. She looked not at Margaret, nor even at Arthur, but at the table where the book rested, as though the truth it contained might rearrange itself if she refused to meet it directly. "This is not possible," she said at last, though without force. "There must be some mistake, some misinterpretation." Margaret did not reply. Arthur's voice came instead, sharper than before. "There is no mistake," he said. "Only exaggeration, half-truths presented as fact. It is a common tactic." Miss Marple lifted her eyes. "Yes," she said gently, "it is, though one must be careful with half-truths. They have a way of pointing toward the other half, even when one would rather they did not." Arthur did not look at her. "It proves nothing," he continued, "even if such records exist, and I do not concede that they do. They would be meaningless without context. Transactions are often misunderstood by those who do not conduct them." Margaret's expression did not change. "You mean," she said quietly, "that if something is done carefully enough, it ceases to matter what it is?" Arthur turned on her. "I mean that you are attempting to dismantle a lifetime's work out of spite." There was a brief pause, not empty, but edged with something sharper. Margaret shook her head. "No," she said, "not spite." Miss Marple, who had been watching them both with that gentle attentiveness that concealed so much, spoke again. "Instinct. Mary Mead," she said. "There was a woman who poured tea with the greatest care. Always the same cup for each guest, always the same measure of milk, always the same sequence. It was very reassuring. One felt that nothing could go wrong in such a household. And yet, when something did go wrong, something quite serious, it was discovered that she had been pouring far too carefully for years. Not out of kindness, out of fear. She was afraid that if she varied the pattern even slightly, something she had done long ago might be noticed." Clara looked up sharply. "What does that have to do with this?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear," she said, "patterns are very revealing. When a person arranges things with too much precision, it is often because they are trying to prevent something from being seen." Edward felt a subtle shift in the room, not in the objects themselves, but in the way they were being regarded. He thought of the candles, the mirror, the ladder, all arranged, all deliberate. "Not just to hide something," he said slowly, "to control how it's seen." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly it." Clara turned to Arthur again. "You told me," she said, her voice tightening, "that everything in this shop had been acquired honestly, that every book, every document, every record—" "I told you what was necessary," Arthur said. The words landed harder than anything he had said before. Clara stared at him. "Necessary?" Margaret watched them both, her expression unreadable. "Yes," she said quietly. "That was always his word." Miss Marple's gaze moved to the ledger once more. "One wonders," she said, "what was considered necessary at the beginning. It is rarely the same thing that becomes necessary at the end." Arthur stepped away from the table. "This is absurd," he said again, though now the repetition had lost its force. "You are all constructing a narrative out of fragments. There is no proof of wrongdoing, no evidence that would stand." He stopped. Miss Marple had picked up the teacup again, the one with the faint mark along its rim. She held it carefully, turning it slightly, so that the light caught the inside. "How very interesting," she murmured. Edward moved closer. "What is it?" Miss Marple did not look up. "This cup," she said, "has been used more than once. That in itself is not unusual. But what is unusual is that it has been returned to the tray in precisely the same position each time." Clara frowned. "That proves nothing." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "Not by itself. But it is part of a pattern." She set the cup down. "Everything in this room has been arranged with intention. The ladder, the mirror, the candles, the book, even the door. Each element is placed so that it leads the observer toward a particular understanding." Edward felt the shape of that understanding begin to form more clearly. "The ghost," he said. "It only appears from a certain position." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "A very specific position." Clara shook her head. "I do not see what that has to do with anything." Miss Marple turned to her kindly. "My dear," she said, "it has everything to do with it, because the person who arranged this knew exactly where someone would stand when they saw it." Clara's expression tightened. "You mean Arthur?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead, she looked at Margaret. "You knew where he would stand," she said. Margaret inclined her head. "Yes," she said. "He always stands there. When he comes up the stairs, he pauses in the same place. He always has." Arthur's voice came, strained now. "That proves nothing." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "No," she said, "but it tells us something very important. The arrangement was not meant for everyone. It was meant for you." Silence followed. Edward became aware of the faint scent again, the cloves, or something like them, still present, still moving subtly through the air. "It's part of it," he said suddenly, "the smell. It leads you to the ladder, to the shelf, to the passage." Miss Marple's eyes warmed. "Yes," she said. "Very good, it is all connected." Clara looked between them, her composure slipping further. "This is madness," she said. "You are treating this like a game, a puzzle, when in fact it is." She stopped. Miss Marple turned to her. "Yes," she prompted gently. Clara swallowed. "When in fact it is something far more serious," she finished. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes," she said. "It is." She folded her hands again. "And that is precisely why it has been arranged so carefully. Not to confuse, not to entertain, but to make something impossible to ignore." Edward looked at Margaret. "You said you didn't come to destroy him," he said. "Only to make him tell the truth." Margaret nodded. "Yes, and if he doesn't," she met his gaze, "then the arrangement continues," she said. Arthur laughed again, though now the sound was brittle. "And what does that mean?" he demanded. "More tricks? More shadows? More—" He stopped. Miss Marple was looking at him very closely now. "My dear Mr. Bellamy," she said softly, "it means that the pattern will complete itself." He frowned. "I do not understand." "No," she said. "Not yet." She paused, then added very gently, "But I think you will." Edward felt a sudden, inexplicable unease. "Miss Marple, what do you mean?" She did not answer him directly. Instead, she looked at the ledger once more. "At the beginning of things," she said, "there is always a choice. A small one, perhaps. A decision that seems necessary at the time. Choices have a way of arranging themselves into patterns. And patterns, in the end, reveal the truth." Clara's voice was barely steady now. "What truth?" Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "The one that has been there from the start," she said. Arthur's face had gone pale again, not with fear alone, with something deeper, recognition, and Edward understood with a quiet certainty. They were no longer uncovering the past. They were approaching something else entirely, something that had not yet happened, but it was already inevitable. Chapter 11. What the attic knew. Miss Marple rose with the small, decisive movement of a woman who has at last placed the last piece where it belonged. It was not a dramatic gesture. She smoothed her gloves, glanced once at the teacup as though noting its position, and then looked directly at Arthur Bellamy. "My dear Mr. Bellamy," she said, "I think we must go upstairs again." Clara let out a short breath that sounded almost like relief. "Yes," she said quickly. "Yes, that is exactly what we should do. If this is to be resolved, then it must be done properly, not in fragments." Arthur did not agree. He did not refuse. He simply stood as if the word upstairs had acquired a weight it had not possessed before. Margaret watched him. "You cannot avoid it," she said quietly. "Not now." Miss Marple's eyes moved from one to the other. "In St. Mary Mead," she said, "there was a vicarage with a cupboard that everyone disliked. It was perfectly ordinary, but it had been shut for so long that opening it felt like an intrusion. The vicar's wife used to say that the longer something remains unopened, the more certain one becomes that it contains something dreadful. In fact, it contained nothing more than old ledgers and a cracked umbrella. But the dread itself that was quite real and far more instructive. Edward felt that the comparison was not reassuring. They moved toward the staircase together. This time, no one spoke as they ascended. The boards complained in the same measured way, though now the sound seemed to carry differently, less like noise, more like acknowledgement. At the turn in the stairs, Edward found himself glancing at the wall, at the faded pattern of flowers worn thin by years of contact. It struck him suddenly that the marks were not entirely random. There were places where the wear was deeper, as though someone had passed that point more often than others. Not by accident, by habit. At the top, the attic door stood open. The candles still burned, but the arrangement had changed. Edward stopped. "They've been moved," he said. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes," she said softly. "Just so." The arc of light had shifted slightly to the right. The mirror had been turned a fraction. The result was subtle, but unmistakable. The pale figure that had hovered earlier was now clearer, more defined, though still not entirely fixed. Clara stepped forward. "This is impossible," she said. "No one has been up here since we left." Margaret did not answer. She stood near the doorway, her gaze moving slowly over the room, as though reacquainting herself with something she had known long ago. Arthur did not move at all. Miss Marple walked to the table. "How very careful," she murmured again. "The adjustment is small, but it alters the effect entirely. One must admire the precision." Edward felt a tightening in his chest. "It's more visible now," he said. "The figure." "Yes." Miss Marple said. It is being clarified. Clara turned sharply. What does that mean? Miss Marple looked at her kindly. My dear, it means that the arrangement is approaching its conclusion. Arthur spoke then, his voice strained. This is absurd, he said. You speak as though this were some kind of mechanism. It is nothing of the sort. It is a trick, a simple trick. Miss Marple did not argue. No, she said gently, not simple, and not, I think, a trick in the way you mean. She adjusted one of the candles slightly. The figure shifted again. This time it held longer. Edward stared. It was not a face, not clearly, but there was something unmistakably human in its outline, now a suggestion of shoulders, of a head inclined slightly forward. Clara gasped. It looks like... She stopped. Miss Marple finished the thought for her. Yes, she said softly. It looks like someone standing just there. She indicated a point on the floor. Edward followed her gesture. It was the place Bellamy had stood earlier, the exact place. Arthur saw it too. He took a step back. That is a coincidence, he said quickly. Nothing more. Miss Marple's gaze rested on him. My dear Mr. Bellamy, she said, there is very little coincidence in a room arranged with such care. Margaret moved forward at last. You remember it, don't you? She said. Arthur did not answer. You remember standing there, she continued. You remember what happened? Clara turned to him, her voice rising. Arthur, what is she talking about? He shook his head. There is nothing to remember, he said. Nothing of any importance. Miss Marple sighed very gently. In St. Mary Mead, she said, there was a young man who insisted he had forgotten a certain evening entirely. He spoke of it quite often, you understand, how little it had meant, how easily it had slipped his mind. It was only later that we realized that one does not speak so frequently of something one has truly forgotten. One speaks of it because one cannot help remembering. Arthur's hands tightened at his sides. You are mistaken, he said. Margaret looked at him steadily. No, she said. You are. She stepped closer to the place Miss Marple had indicated, to the exact position. The figure in the mirror sharpened. For a moment, just a moment, it seemed almost solid. Edward felt a sudden, disorienting certainty. That's where it happened, he said. Clara stared at him. What happened? Miss Marple answered, her voice very quiet. The thing that has been rearranging itself ever since. Arthur's composure broke. This is nonsense, he said, but the words no longer held. There was nothing happened here. Nothing that concerns any of you. Margaret did not raise her voice. You told me it was an accident, she said. Do you remember that? Silence. You told me it would be easier, she continued. Easier to say it had never happened. Easier to arrange things differently. Clara's face had gone pale. Arthur, she said. What is she saying? Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, as though assembling something she had known for some time, but had not yet spoken aloud. My dear, she said softly, I think we are dealing with something that was not meant to be seen at all. Edward felt the pieces begin to align. Not fully, but enough. The ledger, he said. It wasn't just about books. Miss Marple opened her eyes. No, she said. I do not think it was. Margaret looked at Arthur. You wrote it down, she said. Do you remember? Not everything. Just enough. Enough to make it. Arthur shook his head. No, he said. No, that is not. But he stopped, because he had already understood. Miss Marple stepped back slightly. The arrangement, she said, has been guiding us here. Not to the ledger, not to the passage, not even to the illusion, but to this place. She looked at the floor. To this moment. Clara's voice trembled. What moment? Miss Marple met her gaze. The one that has been hidden, she said. Edward felt a sudden cold clarity. This wasn't about the books, he said. Miss Marple inclined her head. No, she said. Nolly. Margaret's voice was very quiet now. It was about what happened in this room, she said. Arthur closed his eyes. For a moment he said nothing. Then, very softly, it was not meant to happen, he said. The words fell into the silence. And for the first time since Edward had entered the house, the truth began, not to emerge, but to admit itself. Chapter 12. The shape of the truth. Arthur Bellamy did not open his eyes at once. When he did, it was not with the look of a man defiant or even defensive, but of someone who had reached the end of a long and private negotiation, and found that there was nothing left to bargain with. It was not meant to happen, he said again, though this time the words seemed to belong less to explanation than to admission. Clara did not move. What was not meant to happen? She asked, her voice steady only by effort. Arthur, you must speak plainly. You cannot leave it like this. Miss Marple stood quietly to one side, her hands folded, her attention entirely on Bellamy, not pressing, not interrupting, but waiting in that particular way of hers which made silence feel less like absence and more like expectation. Margaret did not speak at all. She remained where she had stood, near the place on the floor where the figure formed in the mirror, her gaze fixed upon Arthur with a stillness that seemed to allow no evasion. Edward felt himself holding his breath. Arthur took a step forward, not toward them, toward the place, the exact place, the one Miss Marple had indicated, the one the candles and mirror and every careful arrangement had been directing them toward from the beginning. He stood there, and the figure in the mirror sharpened again, not because anything supernatural had occurred, but because the arrangement had reached its intended alignment. Miss Marple spoke very softly. "Yes," she said, "that is where you stood." Arthur nodded once. "Yes." Clara's voice broke. "Arthur, what happened?" He did not look at her. "There was a man," he said. "A collector, not reputable, not entirely, but useful. He had items that did not always have clear histories. We came to an arrangement." Margaret's expression did not change. "Yes," she said. "We did," Arthur continued. "He came here, to this room. We discussed terms. There was disagreement." He stopped. Miss Marple did not prompt him. She simply watched. Edward felt the weight of the room shift, subtly but unmistakably, as though everything that had been arranged had led precisely to this hesitation. Clara stepped closer. "And?" she said. Arthur's voice was quieter now. "He threatened me," he said. Not directly, not in words one could repeat, but it was clear enough. He knew things about the business, about the acquisitions. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. "You knew he would," she said. "That was always the risk." Arthur shook his head. "I did not expect him to be so careless with it, to suggest that he might speak, that he might expose you." "Margaret," said. Arthur flinched. Clara stared at him. "Arthur, is this true?" He did not answer her. Instead, he looked at the floor. "At this point," he said. "He stood there, exactly there, and He stopped again. Miss Marple spoke very gently. "You stepped forward." Arthur nodded. "Yes." Edward felt the inevitability of it. Not dramatic, not suddenly. Something quieter, more ordinary. "And then?" Clara asked, her voice barely steady. Arthur's hands trembled, though only slightly. "I pushed him," he said. The words fell into the room without emphasis. No one spoke. Miss Marple did not move. Margaret did not look away. Clara's breath caught. "You, what?" Arthur's voice did not rise. "It was not meant to be anything final," he said. "Only to make him step back, to stop him. But the stool..." Edward's eyes flicked to the overturned stool from earlier, now righted and standing near the wall. Arthur gestured faintly toward it. "He struck it," he said, "lost his balance, fell." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. "Yes," she said, "that would do it." Clara shook her head. "No," she said. "No, that cannot be. People do not simply..." "They do," Miss Marple said softly, "more often than one might think. A moment, a misjudgment, a step taken slightly too far." Arthur's voice dropped further. "He struck his head," he said. "There was no question of recovery." Silence again. Not empty, heavy. Margaret spoke at last. "And then," she said, "you decided what had happened." Arthur did not look at her. "I decided what would be said," he replied. Clara's voice trembled. "What do you mean?" Margaret answered. "He was not reported," she said. "Not as he was." Edward felt a chill settle over him. "What happened to him?" he asked. Arthur closed his eyes again. "He became something else," he said. Miss Marple opened hers. "Yes," she said softly. "That is often the way of it." Clarissa stared. "You hid it," she said. "You hid." Arthur did not deny it. "There were arrangements," he said. "Connections. It was not as difficult as one might think, once the first decision had been made." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes," she said. "That is always the most important one." Margaret looked at him steadily. "And the ledger?" she said. Arthur's jaw tightened. "Yes." Edward understood now. "You wrote it down," he said. "Not everything, but enough." Arthur nodded once. "Enough to keep it contained," he said. Miss Marple sighed. "My dear," she said gently, "nothing is ever contained in that way. It merely waits." Clara had stepped back now, her face pale. "You let me believe," she began, then stopped. Arthur did not look at her. "I told you what was necessary," he said again. The words sounded hollow now. Margaret's voice was quiet. "And I left," she said, "because I could not remain in a house where that had been arranged away." Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "Yes," she said, "that is quite understandable." Edward glanced at the mirror, at the figure that had been formed again and again by the careful placement of light and reflection. "It wasn't a ghost," he said. "No," Miss Marple replied. "It was a memory." She looked at Arthur. "A very precise." Arthur did not argue. Clara's voice broke. "And all of this," she said, The candles, the mirror, the passage. Margaret answered. To make him stand here again, she said. To make him see it as it was. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, she said. To complete the pattern. Edward felt the truth settle fully now. Not suddenly, not shocking, simply inevitable. Arthur Bellamy stood in the place where he had once stood before, and this time there was no arrangement left to protect him. Miss Marple spoke once more, very softly. My dear Mr. Bellamy, she said, you see now that nothing has changed, only the way it is looked at. Yes, he said, and in that moment the last piece fell into place. Not because it had been revealed, but because it could no longer be avoided. Chapter 13. The quiet shape of consequence. The candles burned lower. Not dramatically, not with any theatrical guttering, but in that quiet, inevitable way that all things diminish once they have served their purpose. The light they cast had softened, losing its earlier precision, and with it, the figure in the mirror had begun to dissolve, not vanishing, but loosening its hold upon the room. Edward noticed this first. It's fading, he said. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said. That is as it should be. Clara did not look at the mirror. She had moved away from the centre of the room toward the wall where the stacked boxes stood in their careful rows. Her hand rested against one of them, though she did not seem to be aware of it. You killed him, she said, her voice low and strained, and you hid it. You built everything, on that. Arthur Bellamy did not turn toward her. Yes, he said. There was no hesitation in it now, no attempt to qualify, to soften, to explain, just the word. Margaret watched him, her expression unchanged. And now? She asked. Arthur looked at the floor once more. And now, he said, there is nothing left to arrange. Miss Marple folded her hand. My dear, she said gently, there is always something left. The question is only whether one chooses to arrange it honestly. Arthur gave a faint, almost weary smile. I have not been very good at that, he said. No, Miss Marple agreed softly, but one need not be perfect. Only truthful. Clara turned then. Her composure had not returned. It had altered into something else, something quieter, but far more difficult to bear. You told me, she said, that this place was built on trust, that people came here because they believed in what you sold them. Arthur met her gaze at last. Yes, he said. And it was all, what? A construction, a performance? No, he said, and for the first time there was something like urgency in his voice. Not all of it. Most of it was real. The books, the work, the foundation, Clara said. That was not. Arthur did not answer. Miss Marple spoke very gently, in Saint. Mary Mead, she said. There was a woman who inherited a fine house. It had been in her family for generations, and she was very proud of it. She spent years restoring it, polishing the floors, repairing the roof, filling the rooms with beautiful things. Everyone admired it. It seemed perfect. And then, one winter, a crack appeared in the wall. Nothing serious at first. But when it was examined, it was discovered that the foundation beneath had been laid poorly many years before. Not by her, of course. By someone long gone. Still, the house could not be repaired properly until that was addressed. She paused. It is not the fault of the person who inherits such things, she added, but it does become their responsibility. Clara looked at her, then back at Arthur. You could have told me, she said. Arthur's voice was quiet. I could not, he said. Not without losing everything. Margaret spoke then. You lost it anyway, she said. Arthur did not deny it. Yes, he said. The simplicity of it settled into the room. Edward felt a strange stillness take hold, not the tension that had filled the earlier chapters of this strange, unfolding day, but something quieter, more final. What happens now? Asked. No one answered immediately. Miss Marple looked at Arthur. That depends, she said, on what you choose to do next. Arthur considered this. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he turned, not to the mirror, not to the candles, not to the ledger, but to the narrow opening behind the shelf, the passage, the hidden space. He looked at it, as one might look at something that had once been useful, and had become in time unbearable. I think, he said slowly, that it would be best if this were no longer necessary. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, she said, I think that would be wise. Clara's voice was tight. You mean to destroy it? To remove it? Arthur shook his head. No, he said. Not destroyed. Reveal. Margaret watched him carefully. And the rest? She asked. Arthur did not look at her. The rest, he said, will follow. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said. It usually does. The candles burned lower still. One of them flickered. then went out, leaving a small curl of smoke that drifted upward and vanished into the dimness above. The figure in the mirror dissolved entirely, not with any suddenness, simply no longer there. Edward exhaled slowly. "It's gone," he said. Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No," she said, "not gone. Only no longer required." Clara moved away from the boxes. "I cannot stay here," she said. "Not after this," Arthur nodded. "I understand." Margaret did not speak. She stood where she had been, her gaze moving once more around the room, as though taking measure of it, of what it had been, of what it had become. Miss Marple stepped toward the stairs. "Well," she said, "I think we have done all that can be done for today." Edward followed her, though he found himself glancing back once more. Arthur Bellamy remained in the attic, not moving, not speaking, simply standing in the place where everything had finally aligned. They descended in silence. The shop below seemed different now, not altered in its arrangement, but in its meaning. The books remained where they had been. The ladder leaned as it always had. The mirror reflected the room in its small curved way, and yet nothing was quite the same. Miss Marple paused near the door, adjusting her gloves with the same quiet care she had shown throughout. "In St. Mary Mead," she said, as though concluding a pleasant afternoon's conversation, "there was a man who spent many years avoiding a certain truth. When it finally became unavoidable, he found, rather to his surprise, that the world did not end. It altered, certainly. Some things were lost, but others became possible again." Edward looked at her. "Do you think that will happen here?" he asked. Miss Marple smiled. "My dear," she said, "it already has." She opened the door. The bell rang. Outside, the narrow street lay as it had before, unchanged, indifferent, continuing. Clara stepped out without a word. Margaret followed more slowly, pausing only once to look back, not at Arthur, who remained unseen above, but at the shop itself. Then she too was gone. Edward turned to Miss Marple. "And Mr. Bellamy?" he asked. Miss Marple considered this. "He will do what he must," she said, "or he will not. But the choice, at least, is now his." Edward nodded. It seemed somehow enough. Miss Marple stepped out into the street. Edward followed. Behind them, the door closed. The bell gave its small, uncertain sound, and within the shop everything remained, arranged, but no longer hidden,